But yay, I'm so glad everything is working okay. After many, many hours of troubleshooting and YouTube being like, we'll get back to you, I figured, all right, I'll just use my mobile device. So here we are. Very, very glad to be here and to see all of you and just to have this time to get to share one of my favorite things I get to do in my life, which is painting and teaching. So I'm so grateful for everyone here and that I get to share this time with you. So thank you for being here and joining me for our little hour-ish painting lesson today. We get to work on this little painting of one of my most favorite places in the world. It's Mount Baker or Comacultion, in one of the more indigenous languages for the area. And it's a place that I first visited, I think, gosh, 16 years ago now, which is amazing to say. And I've been going back almost every year to witness and watch the glaciers change on this mountain. And it's just a very special place. So I felt extra inspired to want to share a place that over all the times I've been there, even amidst watching all this huge amount of loss and change happen along the glacier, it still feels just so inspiring and so hopeful in many ways is one of the big things for that. So I just wanted to be able to share a place that was special and also that brings me hope amidst all that change. So I think that's all for my little intro. You will need some paper, some paints, as always. Just use whatever you have on hand. You do not need to have anything super fancy. The fun thing about these classes is that my goal is just to get us painting and exploring. And a phrase that I often repeat in my classes is that, I'm trying to inspire us and trying to enter every painting I do too, with the spirit of exploration instead of expectation. So some paintings will turn out looking similar to mine, and some will turn out on their own creative journey. And I just really encourage you that wherever your painting ends up and wherever you are today, just embrace that and have fun. That's my main goal. Be here, share some beautiful time, and just have fun with all of you. Here is our page and my little pieces of paper. So our tools are, for this class, I wanted to keep things basically as simple as we possibly could. So I have a piece of paper, and over here I have the one I'll be working on during our time together right now, which is, you might notice I already have a very small sketch here, or I have a couple lines already here. The reason for that is that I want to get somewhat close to my original version. So I did put a couple guiding lines for myself, but I will walk you through how to sketch this whole scene together. And then you'll want a pencil of some kind. I have a couple different erasers should I need them, a plastic one. This is a little sticky eraser. People always ask me, so I want to make sure I address that. It's just a needed eraser that stays on there when I'm in the field, because then I don't end up losing the little eraser shavings everywhere and have to collect them, which is just a major pain in the rear when you're out backpacking. So a pencil and a paintbrush. I'm using just I think a pretty affordably like $10 or $12 number 2 round I got from Blick Art Materials. I just like this size. When you get it wet, it ends up having a very fine, nice tip to it. And I'm able to use this size paintbrush for all of this painting, whether it's from the big swaths in the sky to all the tiny little details here in the trees. So that's why I find this to be a very, very versatile size. We're looking at Mount Baker here as seen from which side of the mountain was I on for this? This is the Yellow Aster Butte area. Well, let's get sketching. So when I'm working on a scene like this, I want to start with the most major lines that I will see across the whole space. That first major line is going to be this little element of our foreground hillside in through here. And you might notice that I keep my sketch lines really quite light. There's not a ton of guiding lines there. The reason for that is that I want to be able to just paint right over them and not to have to erase them later. I will likely make them a wee bit darker here in this scenario, so that way they show up well for all of us on the video. Once I have that initial foreground line in, and I may end up moving that, but it was helpful for me in this case. I ended up cropping my photo exactly to a 5:7 ratio, because that then made it easier for me when I go to sketch. I can say, okay, the hillside starts somewhere over here. That's not quite the middle and not quite, a quarter. It's somewhere around there, a little more than a third. And over here, it tapers roughly to that left-hand edge. At no point in this process am I trying to be 100% exact. I don't really, I don't need to be. That's the fun thing about this, is that I'm compelled and interested in the overall story of this view and the mountain and the trees. So I don't need to have things be perfectly precise. Once I have that in, usually for this scene, I painted a version of this a few times now, and one time I went right into the mountain, but the problem was I found that when I went right into the mountain, it got too narrow and too tall. So I found this time around that by actually sketching in that left-hand side, that helped me quite a bit to get this rough line in over here. And that helped me a lot just to get in the leftmost shoulder of the mountain, because then I was like, okay, I have this big expanse now. That mountain is reaching, you know, probably like 2/3 of the way, all the way across my page. And that makes it easier for me to then to say, okay, I think I'm feeling pretty good about this shape. And Mount Baker is in many ways, it's a triangle with the top sides from this point of view are pretty similar. And then the top is just flattened. And it took me a while to finally get that correct in my head, because like I mentioned, oftentimes when I sketch Mount Baker, I end up with it too tall and pointy because that's how it feels when you're next to it. One of the hardest things about sketching a scene in general, I think, is just getting our brains to stop seeing and thinking about, that's a big mountain, I love it, and thinking, okay, big mountain, I love it, yes, and what's the actual shape that I'm seeing? That's a little bit harder for our brains to practice with. So I usually will try to start by marking where I think the top of my peak will go. Here I already know it's going to be right about there, but it usually gives me a nice place to say, okay, I think I want to be there, like in that 5x7 window, it was like 3/4 of the way up-ish or something like that. And then that gives me a nice place to be able to work toward when I'm sketching in this left-hand side. And if I was just sketching it for the first time and didn't have like a tiny guideline, then I may end up just doing like a very gentle, very delicate line to start to make sure that it was where I wanted it. Here, I'm fairly certain of where things are going to go, so I can put them in darker. And then that gives me a little bit more flexibility and freedom to say, okay, here's this line, here's the right-hand side, and there's our rough shape. Oftentimes, I don't get this right the first time. Can I tell you how many times I sketch a mountain and then erase the whole shape and then sketch it again? But that's where doing the lighter lines than I did here can help. But honestly, don't worry about it. If your peak is not the same shape, it doesn't need to be. We're here, you know, if our peak is slightly pointier or wider or anything, that doesn't really matter. That's not really a critical portion of, you know, the exact shape is not mission critical here to being able to express the story of this place. Once I have the overall shape in, then I can say, okay, now I want to put in some of the simple lines for our rocks. And this is where I try to be really loose and amorphous, and some people will find that to be scary. I've just learned over time that I'm going to have the most fun with the painting stage if I do as few lines here as possible. I really, when I'm working on a sketch, find that if I keep my sketch looser and less precise, then I leave space for myself when I'm painting later to also be looser and less precise and embrace more simplification than if I really got too bogged down in all the little minute details of how I think this stage is supposed to look. Because no one's going to come up to your painting and tell you, that's not where the black buttes go, or that's where, like, that shoulder is wrong. In my, 16 years of painting now, I have once had someone ask me, why did I move a peak called Mount Good from this, like a skyline in a painting? And I was like, well, it looked kind of like a booby, so that's why I moved it. And the man turned very red, and he's like, yes, that's an excellent reason to remove it. I've learned painting once in front of a bunch of first and second grade boys that you always look for the anatomical shapes and remove them or shift them as needed. So, funny little aside there, right? Of like, we all think of different stuff in paintings, but it's just fun when someone's like, oh, this thing is missing. And it's like, no, it's actually a very intentional reason why. And with that, I think all I need to do now is just put in a few vertical lines to remind me roughly where my trees will go. So there's a tree, here's a little tree here, here, and here. Just like the rest of the painting, I often and continue to find that nice, loose, simple lines here is all that I need to remind me. I don't want to be precise about this. I don't need to be belaboring the point of adding in this branches or anything. This is just here to tell me when I'm working on this painting, hey, you have to put trees there. Don't forget about them. And if I'm working in the field, oftentimes I may leave out those guiding lines altogether, and then just to save time, or because I want to leave even more flexibility in case my painting evolves as I'm working along. We are going to shift gears into painting our sky, and this painting will have 3 very distinct phases. Phase 1 will be our sky. Then that will have to dry before we can go to phase 2, and then phase 3 is our foreground and our trees, and the midground, the mountain stuff, all also has to dry before that. So we'll have 2 built-in nice time periods where I have some fun things to talk about, and also I want to, like, basically where we'll have lovely space for questions as well. I'm looking at this sketch, and I am going to lighten this line here a little bit, because pencil lines are very easy to erase when there's no when there's no paint on top of them. The minute you get some paint on top, they don't want to erase as well. And if we look at our little example here, my line here is quite light in many ways. It's like not even 50% saturation of what this color can do. So that really dark pencil line might show through there. And if I decide I want to bump up above it or down below it, it's just easier to make that a little bit lighter to start. Interesting question. Somebody asked, how often do I go by the rule of thirds when I'm working with a composition? Do I pay attention to it when I'm laying out a painting? So the rule of thirds is this idea that we have, like if this is our little pane here, our 5x7 or whatever size you're working at, that we try to centralize our focal points on the intersection of those third lines. I think about it, and every time I look at a painting, I will usually try to the best of my ability, like unless I really, really want that mountain to be the primary focus, I will bump a mountain out of the central portion. So I very, very, very rarely have a mountain be centered in a painting, unless for some reason that's the main reason or unless that's central to the story about the place I want to tell. In this case, I'm just personally, I usually find that by having like the summit of our peak here roughly falling near one of those thirds, it will just organically feel the most balanced. And the reason for that isn't because we're adhering to some mathematical ratio, it's just because something in the middle, our brain gets stuck there and only wants to look at that. Something way off to the side, that just zooms us off the side of the page and then we're not gonna wanna look at it anymore, then we lose interest because the rest is too boring. So those little points here are just natural points that fall on a page where, and in my experience, I've found that when I roughly put the most interesting stuff near those points, it keeps me as the viewer interacting with this scene and doesn't zoom me off the side when there's other things happening. And I talk a lot more about that idea of composition and the rule of thirds and ways to think about simplifying a landscape in a course I'm about to start teaching here next week, my ink sketching course, where I have a whole little like acronym and fun things. There's just basically different ways to think about composition. And for me, composition is not about following strict rules, not at all. For me, it's about what's the story I want to tell, what are the 1 to 3 things in this scene that I find the most interesting, and then those guide the entire process, whether it's a painting or a sketch with ink or whatever material I'm using. Let's do some painting. So to start, I'm going to get my whole sky wet. And the reason that, maybe let's get the sky wet. So depending on what kind of paper you're on, you will have different effects and different results here. I'm going to begin by pre-wetting my sky, just getting the whole thing nice and damp. And what we're going to do with this is that by pre-wetting my whole sky, I'm basically giving myself a nice damp playground for my paints to move around on. But I don't want them to go crazy. I want them to be somewhat, not controlled, because controlling watercolor is always a not very fun endeavor. It takes some of the fun out of it. I basically want to give the watercolor a space to move and blend with a somewhat predictable result. So to do that, I'm going to start by pre-wetting all of my sky here, and I'll just go across this whole upper zone here, and then we'll block that in. And you might have noticed I turned my page. The reason for that is that when I'm trying to paint up next to any really precise lines, like these lines I have here along the upper edge of my mountain, if I'm painting from a normal orientation, see how the tip of my paintbrush actually blocks that line? Makes it for me almost impossible to paint that edge with any kind of acuity without putting my paintbrush at some funny angles. So I'm never afraid just to move my painting around. I'm adding in a bit more water here. What I'm going for in this sky, you can see it with that light right there, is an even sheen, but I don't want it to be runny. I'm not going for flash flood. I just want an even application of water here to the point where, if I slide my brush through there, see how it takes off some of that moisture, and then if I just gently brush back through it, it puts it back. So we're not super, super wet here. I'm in a pretty nice little damp space. And once I have that, then I'll just check for an even sheen all the way across. It's looking pretty good. And the reason I want that to be somewhat even is that then when I go to apply my paint onto it, it's going to hopefully not spread out too far. And once I put my sky in, I will show you a couple little simple exercises over here that just help explain water control. But those are better suited for a little bit of downtime. So if you want to wait to put in your sky until you see me show that, I can in a minute. But basically what I'm looking for here is that I want my paintbrush with the amount of paint that I'm using over here. So I'm mixing up a nice little puddle. I want this to be in relationship to this now damp page, this now wet page. My paintbrush should be either as wet or a little bit drier than that. The reason for that is if my paintbrush is super duper overloaded and just like really full with paint, and I touch it to this page, then that's just going to spread everywhere. We're going to have a big bloom of color on there. If I squeegee off and wipe off some of the extra here, and if I'm unsure of the result, I can always wipe off the base of my bristles on a paper towel. And then if I come onto my page, that's a little bit dark, so I want to add in a little bit more water there and wipe off some more of the extra. Now when I come back to this page, see how my pigment is moving, but it's not really going too crazy. And I want to apply this watercolor onto my sky, and just some nice, a little bit more water is needed as well. Just some nice arcing brush strokes that go from one side to the other. I'm choosing to make them angled because that seems like a fun way just to give some interesting impressions. You'll notice how this more dry section down here, see how my brush strokes are not moving much at all, they move more up there. That's because we were just more dry down here. So we'll just start building this across. It's drying a bit faster down near the bottom than I think I would like, so I'm gonna just, when that starts to happen, then I tell myself, okay, I need to pick up the pace a tiny bit if I want to get a nice even application of color. And by even, I mean we're just avoiding any weird big blooms or blobs or anything like that. But if I get them, I'm not gonna worry about it, right? Then we're all just exploring and having fun here. So I'm contouring when I get near my peak, and I need to reload the paintbrush with a little bit of water and a little bit more pigment, squeegee off the extra to desaturate that a little bit in terms of the load on that paintbrush. And then if it's not quite light enough, I can, because my page is wet, I can just grab some more water and actually adjust that saturation right there on the fly of that color on the paintbrush. I think for this round, I'm going to fill in this side mostly over here, and then maybe I'm going to wipe the paintbrush off, bring a little bit of light color right across here, because it was just looking a little bit weird to have that color going like a big line going all the way off my page. And this is also feeling a little bit funky over here with this big dark blob. So I'll wipe the paintbrush off, rinse it a tiny bit, wipe off the extra, then just take this now gently damp paintbrush, and I can actually lift out a wee bit of that color and just change completely that whole corner of the painting. At this stage, stuff is starting to dry. If I wipe that paintbrush off quite thoroughly, then I can come in here and make some little adjustments to different parts of this. If my brush was super wet right now, those adjustments would have left a big puddle of paint that would make interesting blooming patterns. But since we're going for a nice soft diffuse sky with some high elevation angled clouds, then I want to have my brush be a little bit more on the drier side. So basically for things like this, I know that as long as my paintbrush is, not super wet, then I can add in a little bit more color here, or I can adjust things as long as I'm not adding in a crazy amount of water. I accidentally went over the top of the peak there, and I really do have to try to remind myself to contour pretty closely and carefully right along the upper edge of that peak, because that's what will define the white of the snow on our peak. I feel like at this point I'm getting a little fussy and fiddly, so I'm going to remind myself I don't need to have this be perfect. Add a little bit more dark color right here and call it good. One of the hardest things about skies of any type is to just put the paintbrush down and say we're good. And now to give a little, while that's drying, because I wanted to build in something to help explain what we just watched there. On this left-hand side, and I probably should have put this first, but anywho, we have it in second. Over here, and this, although I will say, in some ways I like having this little exercise I'm going to do actually after we first tried the sky, because in some ways, I think it's more useful to like see what happened and then understand why it happened afterward. At least for how my brain works. I'm going to make two little rectangles of water, ostensibly clean, but you can see it's not very clean, over here. The first one, I'm going to make it very, very wet. You can see it's like literally puddling up in there. It's a whole bunch of water. If I tilted the page, it would all run to one side. The other rectangle, I'm going to wipe the paintbrush off and have just enough water on there that I can move and dampen the page, so kind of like what I was doing over there, but not so much that it's not going to puddle up anymore. So here's our nice little area. I have just covering it. And this paper that I have underneath my main painting is that Canson XL watercolor paper, which is a paper that dries. I'm gonna add even more water here. It dries really fast. So I have to get this down. And then what I wanna do is I'm gonna come over here and I'm gonna scoop up a whole bunch of paint. Just like get some more water, get some more paint, scoop it up a whole bunch, and make a single vertical line there and make a single vertical line here. We can see right away that the super damp one, our paint is dispersing and moving, and like when I lifted the paintbrush, it pulled a bunch through surface tension, pulled some paint back down. This one that wasn't as wet is not moving as crazy fast or as energetically across that page. And if I were to squeegee off some of the extra water on there, or even roll the base of my paintbrush along my paper towel, which pulls out some of the water but not as much of the paint, and I repeat that exercise, we can see that, oh, really different result. Now our page did dry a little bit, but we get much less movement across either one of these rectangles, and I get overall down here a lower application of paint as well. So what we're seeing right here is just a very simple and small portion of different exercises that we can do to understand water control and the ratio of what's happening on our paintbrush to the amount of paint, and then also to the wetness of our page. And I feel like when I think back to when I first started with watercolor, I think in some ways that was one of the hardest parts, because just understanding why certain things happen. And hopefully now when you look at your sky, if you got a funny little poof ball where you lifted your paintbrush, we can know, oh, that was because my page was wet and my paintbrush was even wetter and it left behind that little drop there when we lifted the paintbrush surface tension, pulled it back down. So if I wanted to avoid that, I would need to have, in comparison to my page, my paintbrush be a bit drier, and we'd avoid those little weird things. This little thing right here is also one reason why you probably saw many of my brush strokes actually went out and beyond the edge of my wet area, because even if I have a ton of paint on here, as long as I carry that brush stroke outside of the wet area, then I can oftentimes avoid those funny little marks as well. A little bit longer, my sky is getting close to being dry. The way that I look for dryness is first, is it still shiny? No? Okay, great. That's step number one. Then I'll take the back of a finger or the tip of a finger. I usually find the back of my finger is a pretty good test of color of paper temperature. What I'm looking for is my paper still cold? If it's still really cold, that's telling me pretty immediately that that page is still evaporating. And that means that depending on how fast it's evaporating and drying, I may end up with unexpected little things if I try to paint right up next to it. I can show you that right over here, because this right here, right over here, maybe it looks like it's dry, and right here it looks like it's dry, but it's still really cold there in the middle. If I put a brush stroke across there, okay, that one was dry enough that not much happened. This one I can tell is still wet. If I put a brush stroke up next to that, see how it's still wet, so then we get these interesting, this paint charge and bleeds and blends up into that still wet area. So if I want to have these really hard, distinct lines for the rock of my mountain, then I want that sky to be completely dry, which in this paper takes a lot longer to dry than this one. This one over here, again, is non-cotton. It's a tree-based fiber, so it dried super fast. This one, which is a cotton paper, just absorbed a bunch more water, so it has a much longer dry time in comparison. I am also painting from a relatively humid environment up here in the Pacific Northwest in the winter. I notice differences between summer to winter in terms of how fast my paints dry. It always surprises me when I go and do a painting. It's like, oh, this is drying so fast in the summer. But then I have students all over the world, and some of them are in very arid climates, like in Utah or Arizona, and their paper may dry 75% faster than mine, depending on the humidity of their conditions inside. And another reason why I chose this specific scene of Mount Baker, and this is probably something that if you look at that reference image or you remember seeing it, there were areas on this mountain where I had shadows and where I had rock. By using just a single pigment, I had to make some simplification choices. One of the biggest is that I am going to choose not really to paint too many of the shadows. There aren't too many. The little blue shadows on the peak aren't super visible this time of day. It is not like this painting here, which I made up in Alaska, where we had super pronounced shadows. Those shadows were one of the stars of this experience, right? They were a huge component of the story of this place. So they had to be painted in. And I had to paint them in first and let them dry, and they weren't wanting to dry because the lake was kind of foggy, and it was just a whole thing, right? So that was a whole different experience where we had big shadow focus. And this is actually going to be a lesson I'll share maybe in a couple months in my Adventure Art Academy classes. I've been holding on to this one for 2 years. I don't know why, but it hasn't gotten released yet. In contrast, what we're doing here, or on this little painting here of Mount Adams, this is a field painting from a couple summers ago, there was very little shadowing here as well, because the sun was coming from over here. So really all we were seeing was just the contrast of our super late summer glaciers, where they had all this interesting, very distant, very obscure glacier texture, and then the rocks. And that was the story there. And Sandra asked a great question. She asked that sometimes in a painting, I will jump around that painting. I'll move from the sky to the foreground and then back, which, because my students know, I am in no way attached to this very typical format I'm doing here. The reason that in this painting, I didn't want to skip around, and we can see it better here, is that Here, the layering, like these trees, if they didn't go all the way up into and near and on top of our mountain, then I would have painted them second. Like if we had, or I would have skipped around or done a ridge line in the middle. But since this layer overlaps huge portions of this one here, I figured it was just simplest to try not to jump around. So jumping around a painting works the best in something like this one, actually. It's a perfect example. I painted sky, and then I think I jumped down to the foreground and painted in all the interesting golden layers, and then came back in and painted this stuff after the fact. So mountain and then ridge lines in the middle. So I'm thinking about layering. I'm always just trying to make it easy on myself that it's okay to jump around, but I do have to think through it before I get started that, you know, I really want this dark layer here, and I don't want to be painting this blue here and accidentally disturb this edge here. That's the biggest reason that I layer things on top of each other, is knowing that if I try to come in, and I can show this over here, if I want to try to put in a layer of color near an edge like this, unless I'm super precise about it, if I like go too much over that edge or hit it, see how that edge is now changing? I'm lifting paint off depending on your paper, I'm disturbing it, it's getting fuzzy and soft and changed. So the layering is a big component of that. So if I want to avoid that kind of thing, that's when I will work more sequentially like this, and especially here where I didn't have a foreground component I could jump to. I'll jump between layers if I have an area of clean paper that will separate them and there's no overlap that has to happen. Let's keep rolling. I want to paint in some mountain. Good questions so far. Thanks, Sandra and Margot, for asking. We'll do our mountain, and as usual, as I see lots of familiar names in the class here, you don't forget that you can pause me. You can rewind me. I get excited and talk too fast. I have since I was an itty bitty child. And I try to slow myself down, but there's never anything wrong with realizing, you know what, I think I've fallen behind. I'm going to hit pause, or you can actually even slow me down on YouTube, and you can play me at a lower speed if you would like. I wouldn't really recommend a faster speed. That would be it's challenging. But just, I want to reiterate that, because if you have to pause, rewind, etc. slow, that is in no way an indication of your skill or ability. That's just that I talk fast, I can work fast, and I want everyone to feel comfortable and have fun. So if you're going to have more fun by taking a bit more time, or if your conditions are taking longer to dry, then please feel free and welcome to do that. I would never want someone to feel, you know, like they're doing something wrong by using these tools. That's one reason why I teach online, is because it has these incredible abilities to make this process fun and more accessible to people, depending on where you are at in your creative journey. Rocky shapes, and I'm trying to think of how I want to intro these. Rock shapes, the biggest thing that I think of, and this is what I'll say here, if you want more information about this, I have much more in-depth segments in my Adventure Art Academy classes, but the basic thing that I think about when I'm working on a mountain pattern is that, okay, if I'm a little water droplet that comes down and is going to hit this mountain, where, based on what I see in that reference image, which directions is that water droplet going to go? Like if we have some big craggy rock shapes over here, that water droplet would hit these and then go roughly in this direction. If I have a big craggy rock shape here that radiates out like that, that water droplet is going to hit here and go that way. And oh look, down at the bottom part of the mountain where it's not as steep, all of a sudden this stuff looks less steep to me. The lines are angling out more to the side, so now my water droplet's going to go that way. And I try to have my paintbrush mirror the movements of where the water droplet would go. That means that if I'm working on the upper part of a peak, I will often have my paintbrush strokes, you know, they'll be either steeper or shallower or more angled or less angled, depending on where I am on that peak. And the brush strokes I'm making, especially in a small painting like this, are just like this. They're little dashes, little triangular bops and bobbles that contour and connect and reach and wrap around the different shapes. The key thing that I think about when I'm working on rocky shapes seen from a distance for Northwest peaks is that I try to end most of my brush strokes, unless I see an area where I want a more rounded or more blunt spot, I usually try to end them in a more tapered shape. That's just, for me, something that's somewhat emblematic of the way rocks and ice and glaciers look, is that these shapes very often will come to a more tapered and small shape. So that's a couple little tips there. And again, I cover so much more, way more in depth about that in my Adventure Art Academy stuff. And thinking about water control, before I forget, earlier this year, I finally, these students have been asking for so long, I finally made a 36 part, there's like 36 different little videos, kind of beginners or foundations course where I have three or four whole sections all about water control. That's my exploring watercolor course. And I just wanted to mention that because I feel like sometimes it can feel really intimidating to dive into a new medium. And I designed that for folks who were like me 16 years ago. Basically it's like the course I wish I had had, where the focus is on fun and play and experimentation, but also how do we actually get this medium to behave a little more for us? With a little more level, there we go. All right, let's continue on. So with these rocky shapes, since I am right-handed, I find that I often am the most comfortable starting over here on the left side. And that's just because then when I'm working across, I'm not covering, like my paintbrush, again, isn't covering my little shapes. When I'm thinking about the color I want to be darker than the sky, but not at full concentration yet. So somewhere in like the 50 to 60, 70% darkness range. And then I'll just start building in these shapes. The color that I'm using is called Indanthrone Blue. Should have mentioned that earlier. But it is a beautiful, super amazing dark pigment. But this dark pigment also, I'm going to move my hand away a little bit to try to keep the focus locked more in the middle. We'll see if my hand will keep nabbing the focus here. This pigment is interesting because it dries much more dull and less saturated than how it appears when we first put it down. So some pigments are like that, and it's just a little extra challenge that our paints throw at us that we have to then pay attention to that color shift that can happen sometimes very, very dramatically inside of a painting. Like this feels a little tiny bit too dark right now, but I have a feeling it will hopefully dry a little bit less, a little more dull. But if I got darker in this one than my last one, it doesn't matter as long as I'm still roughly within that mid-range-ish of my color, then I'm happy. When I'm adding in more of these rock shapes over here, you might notice how I'm also leaving some interesting little white gaps here and there, or in a lot of places, then choosing to fill them in later. Those white gaps are just one of my most favorite tools I've found for painting mountains, especially, and really lots of landscape elements, because I think they're such an efficient and fun way to indicate, hey, there's like rocky detail and stuff happening without me having to paint everything. I use them in foliage. I use them inside of mountain shapes. I use them so often because they really are these really powerful tools. As I go across this peak now, then I'm going to keep my color right around where I've had it just for consistency's sake. And definitely got darker than my last one. I'll show you in a moment here, but that's okay. Right? It doesn't matter. We're just having fun and exploring and leaving some little white gaps. And this whole triangle of rock is like a big portion of the mountain that reaches this way. And it's a little bit darker, not darker, but it's a little bit more triangular shaped. As I come down toward the right-hand side, I'm dipping my paintbrush a tiny bit into the water. See how it's a little bit more dilute right there? I'll try to move the light aside. There we go. I want to have this slowly fade from darker to a bit lighter as I go across this whole shape here. And as I get closer to this right-hand side, I start to make bigger, more swooping, get some more water, just more overall larger brush strokes because I don't really care about the detail here. I have trees that will cover the vast majority of this, so I'll just have brush strokes that are roughly doing what they need to, which is conveying, hey, there's some rock there, and I'll go back to my darker pigment, reaching up again toward the top part of my peak here. Here's this interesting rock shape. Here's some cool rock shapes that run all along the right-hand side of Komokolshin here. So all along this right-hand side, and those connect and just blend into that lighter stuff I had already built in. Interesting blobby, like kind of like a kidney bean with some little fingers on it over here. Interesting blobby shape. Maybe I'll add another little blobby shape right there. And then, okay, that's feeling pretty good so far. Maybe at this stage I'll rinse the paintbrush off since the mountain's starting to feel a little bit bald. I'll rinse that paintbrush off, and maybe with that more dilute color, you can see I'm much lighter now, I can do things like add in some little rock shapes there, not quite dilute enough. Maybe we'll add in a little bit of hint of rock shapes right there, and we'll come back and add even more of like a shadowy, dirty rock color. And for now, I just want to get in some other little rocky shapes or glacier impressions in a couple different spots across our peak. And oh my gosh, I don't want to forget about the stuff over here. So this thing right here, this is one of the little tricks I use, is that this is already mostly dry. And if I'm going to have a hard edge, like where, see how like this shape and this shape, when they connect, they're going to get like a hard line. And this is not quite dry enough, but maybe that'll show it. If I want to avoid a weird hard line that's super visible, like we can see over here, I painted all the way over in one fell swoop. by terminating this brush stroke in this zone of color behind some trees, then that hard line just won't be visible. That's one reason, or one way I can give myself more flexibility to go back to this part of the painting is by planning out where those little edge junctions can be. Going back to the darker color I had been using earlier, I didn't get it quite dark enough, I don't think. Get my palette back in view for you. I can put in this whole shape here. And this one I think I want to be darker-ish on the left-hand side, and then as it goes across, it'll maintain some of that darkness. Still thinking about like, okay, what direction would the water flow here? This is overall a more shallow shape, so it's not as steep. So my brush strokes are going to be more horizontal. And I need some more paint. And we come across to this left-hand side. Oh, that's way too dark. So if I put a brush stroke down too dark, grab some water, grab some more paint, and just reevaluate and come back. I want to have an interesting snow field across here. Snow field, there's the edge of the snow field. Here goes my brush down. Is it exact? No. Does it need to be exact? No. And I'll just start filling in because this whole bottom shape is just an amorphous, interesting thing. I don't want to paint all the detail, so I grab some clean-ish water and just wrap that right into the bottom. I will, if I'm lucky, get some interesting blooming shapes through there. A little bit more paint needed here. Oh, a little bit dark there, so I can blend it in a little bit if I'm lucky. Then I can just paint in this whole sub-ridge line, leaving some interesting snowy-esque shapes there. And then, like I mentioned, this little guy just connects right over there. Then we have this whole section in. I will oftentimes, with a scene like this, where I have a super, super dark foreground, I will carry my water, like you saw there, and my pigment across the lines I sketched, just so that way if I want to have some trees that have a little bit different shape or something, I have more flexibility. I will also keep an eye on, like if I got a really dark blob there, maybe I need a little bit more dark there. You know, I even need to carry that dark a little bit over there, just to balance out that really dark area that I had. So that way it's not too, doesn't stand out too much on its own. And that's looking pretty good. It's just feeling a little bit light here, so while things are still wet and damp, I can drop in some darker color and it won't do anything too unpredictably weird. But I'm also getting some interesting blooming patterns that will feel like a cloud or something like that because of that extra water that I added there. The last thing I want to do for this stage of the painting is just to make sure to miss any interesting rock shapes. Like maybe I actually want a little bit of a rock shape that goes across like that and goes up a little bit higher into that area. This rock shape is looking a little weird and jumbled, so I can just use a lighter version of my color there. Oh, and I missed an entire portion of some rocks right here. So let's put in this rocky friend and have that connect down near that. And we'll maybe have a little extra lines right through there. And then now I can rinse the paintbrush off, wipe off the extra on my water cup, wipe off some extra here. So I want to go for a nice dilute and pretty controlled, nice light gray color. I want it to be visible, but not too crazy. And we can see that it's nothing too dark or too light, just dancing this around next to some of my rocks, not going overboard, but this is just a way I find, this is the kind of final step that really goes a long way toward just anchoring. I can put in some interesting little curved lines for my glaciers. I find it just really anchors these shapes and helps them feel a lot more grounded in the mountain. Like before, they felt like they were floating a little bit, and this darker layer just helps the whole thing feel more authentic and more realistic for that shape. Okay, it's easy to overdo it though. So let's just put in a couple little arcing lines to give the impression of some glacier through there. They're very, very light, they're subtle, but they're definitely there. This can be carried all the way down. And then I think I also missed a few rocks over here. This is feeling a little bald, so I'll just grab a bit more color if that's the case. Want them a tiny bit lighter, a little bit of water on the paintbrush there. And that might blend down to that stuff I just added, that's totally fine. There's no right or wrong way to do this. And just adding in a little bit more dark color in a couple select spots, like this line should be a little bigger. So there we go, that feels a little better. And then I also want a little bit more rock action right here. Is that 100% accurate? Probably not, but does it need to be? No. I just wanted to have those lines in a way that helped make that shape feel a little bit more grounded in my space. Okay, this needs to dry. It's very, very close. So while I give it a chance to dry, what questions do folks have? What I find really interesting about a painting at this stage is that when we think about value, which is the range of light and dark in a scene, Right now, we actually don't have a huge range of light and dark. We have our very, very white, and then we have these darker stuff. We don't have our darkest darks yet. And to my eye, oftentimes a painting won't quite feel cohesive or finished until we add in those super dark darks to help ground the whole scene. But very intentionally, we did have to make our mountain lighter, so that way it feels farther away. Because things that feel, the darker things are, in general, they're usually closer to us inside of a scene, and that helps it feel like we have more depth there. I'm just giving myself a little bit of dry time. And while that's drying, there was a fun little thing I wanted to show you, and I'm trying to find... I've been told and I know that I make sketching mountains look easy. And a lot of the reason that they look like that when I work on them is this sketchbook right here. So this is back, I think 4 years ago now. I'll try to keep the mountain visible above this. I decided I wanted to become more efficient and better at sketching. So I did 100 days of ink sketching where I did a different sketch each day. So I started with trees and was like, all right, we're gonna start with a little more simple stuff. I had some where I was like, I don't know what I'm doing. I'm super confused, very simple. Then started adding in different rocks and whatever was interesting to me, using a brush pen or a paintbrush with ink, whatever I had on hand to use. And some days I had 10 minutes. But for all of them, I set a timer of I would do no more than 30, at the very, very most, like 45 occasionally. So I started very simply, and then I started to figure out that as I was doing it, getting more and more days into this, we can see that things start to change. Like here's another simple day. There was a very simple day. But then I started to realize, okay, I'm getting more confident in rendering mountains. And that was a big focus for this 100 days was Northwest landscapes. Until I had then like a little bit more complex sketch there. And I had a sketch like this that was really a big breakthrough. And what made these sketches unique is that I was doing no pencil ahead of time. I go right in with my pen. That was my goal, was to just become really confident with putting a scene down and having that practice. And when I look back, I really was amazed to see how much this practice informed all of my painting. And I'm sharing it because one, I wanted to show like that progression of, and some days I wouldn't get where I want, and other days I was like, oh, I did it, right? But I just wanted to show that, learning and working with any new tool and way of seeing and doing different landscapes is a non-linear progress. Some days I'm like, wow, I did amazing. Other days I'm like, I can't sketch the desert. What am I doing? Here's another desert day where I was like, I can't figure it out. But I learned so much from this, and it informed my painting practice so much that this is the 3rd year now where I'm doing it's my ink sketching course arose from this experience. And I just wanted to share the sketchbook because I think it's fun and a nice little activity for while my painting is drying. Because again, painting is so hard and learning to draw and everything is challenging. And I just really want to encourage you just to try and play. And if you would like a more guided experience that has techniques and things to help you along the way, then ink sketching course could be really fun for you. But, I have no expectations. I just wanted to, lift the mystery a little bit, I think, from some of that process of okay, how the heck did I get competent and comfortable working on landscapes like I do? And really this process was pretty transformative. And I look back on it and I'm so glad I did it. This one here, I'm actually going to turn into, I think, the patch I'm going to make for students this year in the course, but a lot of fun there. Okay. Let's go back to our painting. I think things are dry enough, and I do not see too many questions in there at this point. So let's finish this painting. Just like I noted for this last section, for trees, I know I can go fast. They are also very repetitive. As you can see, this is basically the same idea across the whole bottom portion of this painting. So I will walk us through some of the most critical ones, and then I'll just kind of go across the others and ask questions if you'd like. But I will just roll across those somewhat rapidly. And trees are so fun. Okay, and also trees, one last thing. Trees used to mystify me a ton until I found this magical tool here called a brush pen. This is something I use in that course and use for each of the classes. This thing is so fun because see how it has a little teeny tiny tip? It's like a fountain pen cartridge with a brush tip. You can make itty bitty teeny tiny lines and these big, bold, interesting swoopy lines. Once I did a whole bunch of practice with this, I was like, wait a second, my paintbrush feels so much easier now. So this really informed how I think about trees, especially silhouetted inside of a scene, because I've sketched so many of them over those 100 days. And of course, the last number of years working with my students. But it's a fun little thing that we don't always have to be playing with watercolor or a painting medium to be building the skills that we use when we're painting, which was really surprising to me. I didn't expect that 100 days of sketching to have that outsized of an impact on my other elements of my creative practice, like my watercolor and my field sketching. Let's do our trees. And like I promised, I want to show you the more prominent ones. Trees are interesting because they are asymmetrical in nature in most cases. And my brain and many other people's brains want to default to a symmetrical shape. And what I mean by that is that oftentimes our brains look at a tree and they're like, hey, that's a tree and that's this thing. And it has the perfect little branches. We need to override that and look at the actual distinct personality of many of our trees. When I'm doing trees, I want my brush in what I call precision mode, which means that I have my nice super dark puddle of paint here, and either on the edge of my palette or the edge of my actual paint pan itself, I'm going to squeegee off a bunch of that extra moisture until I can get a really nice fine tip here. If it's still too overloaded, paper towel, where did that go? I seem to have lost track of my paper towel. I would take the paper towel and roll along the base again. It's MIA somewhere in my studio. So I'll just squeegee off some additional paint here. This is really just deloading the paintbrush and putting it into a more fine tipped orientation. So oftentimes I choose not to start with the most critical, most mission visible trees in my scene, which here I'm going to go to these two little guys on the left, little friends here. I start with trunks. And then from those trunks, I will have little tiny dots and dashes of brush strokes, and those are what add in the elements of the branches. So just imagine those and squish them up next to our trunk. And then here we will have these nice, it doesn't take many, especially for trees this far away. Just a couple little dashes and swoops on either side of those trees, and it comes together at the base, and voila, we have trees. The main thing is just to avoid making the symmetrical perfect thing. In between these more detailed tree shapes, I will use my paintbrush also in that precision mode, using just upright brush strokes that go from top down to my lower edge or down to this boundary here, and those brush strokes will serve as little marks to give the impression of trees. Let's do this little friend here. We have two little guys here, and they're not perfect. But these over here, I'm trying to make them all look a little different, right? Some have scragglier branches that are more narrow, some have thicker branches. And I can switch back to this little abstracted tree mode and through here. What I'm doing with my brush here is I'm starting with less pressure at the top of the stroke and increasing the pressure as I go down, and also varying the height and the amount of overlap of those trees, and that will then give me this really organic edge there. For select ones, if I want to, I can make it a little taller, put a couple little branches just sticking right off there if I want to add that in. And this is also where things get a little interesting, because I do want to have this dark color here blend into the whole bottom of the painting. So before this stuff here dries too much, and it was almost dry, I'm going to grab a bunch of water, just dip the whole paintbrush tip in the water jar, and then just go all the way along this area. I know I want a handful of areas where I have some white gaps showing through, so I'm actually just going to grab a bunch of paint and go all the way across this whole area with a bunch of water, because then I can drop the dark color in on top and then just let it blend and bleed down into it. So we'll have some little white gaps here and there. They can just create interesting impressions of patterns. There we go. So just building that in, and then we'll get that nice, really, really dark color in the upper portion as we go along. So I've got the whole baseline built in. Now I get to go back to sketching trees or painting trees, and I'll get my paintbrush, go through I'm going my paint here, the Indanthrone, at the darkest I can possibly make it. So the only way to make it darker would be to take it right out of the tube. So it's basically mass tone, which is another fancy word to describe what the color looks like when it comes out of the tube. Putting a little bit of extra paint here just to blend into that wet area. Now I say, okay, it's really prominent tree time. So we'll make this nice little narrow trunk, and then we'll have a little friend that's closer to it on the right and then farther away here on the left. Once I have those trunks in, gather some more paint. And these little trees, as far as I noticed, they had a little bit of upward angling branches at the very top, so I can put that in. This one has upward angling, and then they transition into fun little outward facing branches, and there's some that go in between. And because these trees are in many ways like a counterpoint to the big prominence of the mountain, they're a really important visual anchor here. So that's why I am taking more time with them than some of the other trees, as you'll see as I get farther across, where I'm like, you don't really matter that much. They're still important and nice to have, but they're not critical like these are in terms of, again, that story of what's happening in this place. And like I mentioned, they also are a very nice visual counterpoint to all of the stuff happening in the peak. My stuff down here is starting to dry. That's no problem. I can drop a little bit of dark color in here if I want, just to make sure that some of that darker Indanthrone gets integrated into that area. But if it does start to dry too much, don't worry about it. You could also just add some more water in there and let weird blooming patterns and blending stuff happen. You can smear the really dark color around, whatever makes you happy. I try not to overdo it too much, but in this area, since it's all going to be dark and light, I don't worry about it too much. Let's keep rolling here. As I go across here, I get to go back into my paintbrush into my abstracted tree mode. So I think of this almost like a sewing machine. I'm putting little stitches of trees across this whole area, some taller, some not as tall, some have little hints of branches coming off of them, others don't. And then we quickly arrive, and I really just want to avoid like super repetitive patterns, so I can overlap the brush strokes as much as I need to avoid those. I come to these two little trees right here. And oftentimes folks find that when I'm working on trees like this, they, in videos like this, just watch me put them in and then put them in their own painting. So if that's you, that's an awesome common tactic, since I do know I can move a little faster. And then as I go across, and I want to put a little bit more dark down there, as I go across, I will put in this little clump here. There's 1 and 2, another little tall one next to it. And these two are so close together that my brush strokes will just go from one side to the other and actually just overlap both of them. I really just wanted that nice little dual trunk up above. Then I want to continue across, and since my stuff down below this is really trying to dry on me, I am going to, I think, try to finish putting my dark, like little abstracted trees in all the way across, just so that way I can have that layer of color integrate into the stuff down below. Once that's put in, I then get to say, okay, we have some more important trees here. Brush is in precision mode. There's one of my trunks. There's my secondary trunk. Let's put in some little branches off these friends, dancing side to side. And right now I am not looking at my reference image. I just decided, I'm just looking at my other painting. When I initially worked on the practice one, I was looking at the image to help me figure out, what did I need these trees to be, but I'm also just trying to really simplify. I don't want to paint trees forever, so I'm not painting every little tree that we see there. I'm not counting them. I'm not focusing on every single one. Just really trying to say, okay, I need enough trees to convey the story of this really beautiful line of trees in front of my mountain, but I don't need any more than that. Need just enough. So often when I'm painting, I remind myself and say almost like a mantra in my mind that I just need just enough of the right details to convey what's happening, but I don't want to overboard it with too many other ones. So there's two little trees over there. And I think I'm going to call that good for our trees and possibly for our whole painting. I just want to say that if you would like to continue to learn how to paint or draw with me, or just want to continue to, if you enjoyed this and thought it was fun and want to do more, then I will be sending you some extra notes in the follow-up and the recording email, like a link for the ink sketching course and for my Adventure Art Academy classes. I also really care about making what I teach accessible, which is one huge reason why accessible in terms of price, which is a huge reason why I offer these free classes. I never want cost to be a barrier. It was to me when I first started painting. I couldn't afford any of the classes on my own. So I feel so lucky, and I love the fact that I can offer a sliding scale. So if you would need that to have the classes be accessible, let me know. I also keep it low, like for the Adventure Art Academy, which includes things like ink sketching and these fun paintings that I release a new one each month filmed in the field. Right now it's $29 a month. I'll probably raise it to $30 in the next couple of weeks, but try to keep that affordable. But if that's not in reach for you, then just email me. And again, I have that sliding scale. I know it's a difficult financial time for many, and for me, painting is what brings me the most joy and just brings me peace and hope whenever I get to paint. And I would never want cost to be a barrier to someone else if you also wanted to engage in this creative practice. So there's my fun little spiel. And ink sketching is so fun. I know I keep mentioning it, but it's just such a fun course. Like, I wonder if I have my sketchbook from last year. Where is it? Oh, I did a lot of mountain sketches last year. Some of them with this shiny, like, you're not iridescent, but I forget what the term is, a sheening ink. And I was just like, this is the coolest stuff. It gets everywhere. Maybe I'll film a class with some of this little extra bonus for the ink sketching course, because it's just so quirky and neat. And I just found it so fun to work with, but it does get absolutely everywhere. Like a tiny drop of speck of dried ink just turns everything immediately blue. So it's a lot of fun, and I love that, through that course I get to connect with people all over the world. It's amazing. I have live classes like this, but then I also record it and have extra recorded things on top of it. So just if that is something that would make you happy, here's some more trees, then check it out. But otherwise, enjoy our free class here, and I look forward to sharing more of these. I'll probably be doing another free class, I think from probably with a misty fjord scene from Alaska in the next 2 to 3 weeks. So I'll have another one coming up soon. I saw an interesting question from Margot who said that one of the hardest challenges in paintings is knowing when to call it quits on a painting. It's easy to overdo it with watercolors and things end up murky. Yes, exactly. So one of the ways that what's a good way to answer this? Honestly, I think when I think back to my early stages of watercolor, I did the same thing, Margot. I would often just want to keep adjusting things and adding colors, and then the more you mix colors and the more you layer them on top of each other, we lose this luminosity, right? We can see the way the light of the paper is shining through. And I think the single biggest thing I did that helped me kind of break out of that habit of overworking was doing monochromatic landscapes. I went through a phase where for a year, and this is mostly what I painted, I was pretty busy with work. I had an hour-and-a-half commute each way, and I didn't have a ton of time, but I found that these were a little faster, and I just love the way monochromatic landscapes, every time I painted them, I was like, oh, I feel like I'm seeing light really differently and shadows, and I'm noticing more of that in a landscape, and I was less afraid of pushing and pulling areas of light and dark. And then once I did a bunch of those with a single color and really got good at seeing light and dark in a painting and a scene, then when I went back to color, it was like, oh, I'm feeling so much more confident to fill in a whole area with color and go pretty dark and bold. So that way I don't have to hit it again. I wonder if I have a good example of this over here. Let's see. Here's a couple little examples, actually. I pulled some for us. This little painting here is one that it was a pretty quick sketch. It was this is in the Glacier Peak Wilderness, super buggy, some of the buggiest, worst buggy conditions of my entire life. And this painting was done in 4 sections: sky, peak, and then the flowers in the foreground, the midground. So I didn't do any extra layering on top. All of this is just letting the colors blend next to each other and being really confident just going in dark and colorful. And I know that without having had this practice for so long ago, probably 12, 15 years ago now or so with the monochromatic landscapes, I wouldn't have developed, I think, the confidence to paint like this. So you can see one example there, and here's another example of working in a similar way, but in a very different scene, a little watery scene of Lake Crescent near the Olympics. So again, this idea that I want to just put down a whole area, and I don't want to have to paint these peaks or these little hills multiple times. I want to just go bold and dark with them. And so that's one way that I found to work, to get myself out of that, was to practice with the monochromes. Then someone asked if I could talk about the Indanthrone Blue versus neutral tint. So this painting was Indanthrone Blue, one of my absolute favorites. It does have that pretty dramatic saturation and darkness shift when it dries, unless I'm working with it in full saturation. My other favorite monochromatic pigment is this one here, which is neutral tint. And what I love about this one is that it can go very, very light on its own. It can go even lighter than that. And it can also go exceptionally dark. So it goes to a true dark black. What's interesting is that Indanthrone is a single pigment color, and neutral tint is actually a combination of 3 different colors. It has a violet, a black, and a blue in there. But it really is a very mid-ground, lovely neutral gray. And this is the one that, when I did that year basically of monochrome painting, this is the one I used for most of that. I didn't have Indanthrone Blue yet. So that one's also lovely. I like both of them because they make blooms really readily. They're not sandy, granulating textured paints. So to me, they're really interchangeable for monochrome paintings. It's just depending on what feeling I want. Do I want the feeling of the blue, or do I want the feeling of the gray? To me, they perform similarly, but just a little bit of a less dramatic drying color shift and saturation, darkness shift, although almost all watercolors are going to dry a little bit lighter than how they appeared when they were still wet and juicy for us. So maybe not the most detailed answer to their question, how do I choose? It's just, what do I feel like working with that day? Because they really do perform very similar. They both have very small particle sizes, which is why I love them so much, because you can get this very interesting interplay of water. I see with the edge right here where the pigment moved, but not too much, just beautiful. The blooms in here, and more heavy particle sizes that we find in our granulating paints. They will not make blooms or little fuzzy, soft edges like that in the same way. They behave quite differently. I wonder, do I have a painting lying around showing a granulating pigment? I think I do. No, not that one. Here we go. Let me bump this out of the way since this is now wet. Hang on a second. Here's an example of a granulating pigment at work. So see how up here, this is like a sandy looking texture? So that's gonna be your granulation. That's the term that watercolor makers use. You can see it here as well when I use some ultramarine blue. It looks sandy. And it's an incredible property to use, but usually for students who are just starting out, I usually recommend not getting too many granulating colors because it does really change the watercolor behavior and it just makes it a little bit harder to work with, I think, until you get the hang of just that basic water control. And this is a fun little page. This was inspired by a backpacking trip I think a year and a half ago, up to this incredible, like remote kind of like lake I would never go to except for it was large season, and I had some friends that were climbing out there. This is the trail, tons of switchbacks, like 47 of them. You gain, I think, almost 4,000 feet to get up to it, but it was incredible. The light was incredible, and it was just stunning this time of year, not too many other people up there. And it was just such a cool place to be. And this is actually a page that was a whole class in my story maps course. I was just grabbing whatever I had on hand, and that wrapped up in December. So if you want to learn how to paint different maps with different paintings, that would be the way to go for that one. Let me put that little guy aside. Okay. Well, I don't see any other questions from folks before I wrap us up for the evening. Here's a fun little ink sketch. I'll put it there to cover up some of the glare from my lights on my table surface. My table is just a piece of veneer plywood that I've put a bunch of finish on, so it's actually an impermeable waterproof surface, which I love, but it's kind of glary. Better than glass though, I will say that. This little sketch I actually made on site in the desert in the fall during this incredible 2-week trip with my dad, where we got to go hike to all these really beautiful places, and I'm excited to share that one in the ink sketching course. Normally for the ink sketching course it's all studio based, but I had time to get to film a little field sketch that I can share with everybody as part of that course. Okay, this was super fun. Hope everyone has a great night. And again, just thanks for sharing time with me. I always feel so much more hopeful, and you all bring a lot of joy to my life, the opportunity to share my love for this medium with you. So thanks for being here.